This is a magical spot. It's in sort of a slightly mysterious county called San Benito County. It's in the Bay Area, but nobody really knows where San Benito County is. And what's interesting about this particular area is it's kind of the intersection of where a number of counties intersect and a number of geographical, political boundaries kind of converge. So we're right on the nexus of Santa Cruz County, San Benito County, Santa Clara County.
When did you start the Popelouchum endeavors?
Well, it wasn't a vineyard when I started, and it was about, I think, eight or 9 years now. It was pasture land and grazing land. And I started planting olive trees and fruit trees and eventually some grapes. Still got a ways to go.
What is the average age of most of the grapevines that you planted here?
Well, these are now about 5 years old. We just grafted them. It's a kind of a long and painful story why they ended up getting grafted. So this is their first year as in their new reincarnation as Petit Montsang. Everything else is about 4 years old. We harvested some grapes out of the nursery when they were we had nurseryed the vines, so we made a little baby harvest from the nursery and then we dug them up and planted them. And then we're going to get our first real commercial harvest this year.
I'm more of an armchair wine guy. So as I understand it, grapes are best suited to vinification grapevines after about 4 years of age. Is that correct, usually?
Well, they're funny because they're like children. They're very cute when they're young, and then they get very obstreperous when they're teenage, and then they get sort of interesting again as adults. So actually young vines, sometimes in their very first leaf or very first harvest, maybe at the age of 3 years or 4 years, make some very good wine. And then they go through sometimes an awkward phase, and then they come out of it some years later.
Interesting. I experienced that in bottled wine, the dumb phase, where they're beautiful and brilliant in their infancy, and then with the tertiary notes later on.
Yeah.
It's fascinating that also in the viticultural aspect that rings true as well.
Wine is friggin' mysterious. There's no question about it. Wine and grapes are both mysterious, and the most interesting ones are the most vexatious. There's a lot about wine. You know, we're accused sometimes of being wine snobs because sometimes we are.
Yes.
But wine is also arcane and esoteric and counterintuitive in many respects. And the practical reason we have a circular vineyard here is we've got a pond right in front of us, and a circular orientation of the vines is a more elegant solution when you got a pond, when you got a circular pond.
How so?
I don't know. It just conforms to this. You have concentric circles around.
I understand. So tell me a little bit about the different stages of what you attempt to do here at this vineyard site, if you would please.
Well, at the risk of being too prosaic, we're growing grapes, conventional varieties, not to say conventionally, but we're growing known named grape varieties like Grenache and Grenache Blanc and Grenache Gris, and Rossese and Rouquet, those sorts of things. But we're growing them in a sort of less conventional manner, which is to say head-trained in an old-fangled fashion. So we're doing that, and that's relatively straightforward. Many grapes have tragic flaws, and it's interesting. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but grapes, when they're grown historically, have this tendency to either evolve or devolve. So, for example, in Burgundy, where you had a lot of very focused monks studying Pinot Noir evolved and became refined and fine-tuned to the site over many centuries. And so therefore the quality of Pinot is exquisite in Burgundy. Turns out grapes really do very well in depleted soils. And there's ways of remedying that, mostly through the introduction of animals. And sheep manure in particular is a great soil amendment and rectifies a lot of the problems of missing nutrients. It makes the minerals a lot more bioavailable to grapevines.
Are these trained or trellis? I don't know the terminology. like all the other ones, or are you doing different
Yeah, no,
trainings?
these are different. This is called gobelet, or goblet.
What major wine growing region trains their grapes like this?
This is virtually the south. All of the southern France grows their grapes like this.
What are you doing right now?
Well, I was just suckering the interior shoots to open up the center. You want to create kind of essentially a wagon wheel. This wants to look like a circle.
Ah.
So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spurs at the moment. We'll kind of ultimately want to end up with about 8. And the uppermost one is pointed out. You want your shoots to kind of grow out and kind of create a little umbrella effect. Clusters sit underneath and they get diffuse light rather than super intense direct light.
Understood.
So what's really cool about pruning these vines is you have to think. Those are probably going to be trained on cordon. Cordon you don't have to think. Cordon is just automatic. You just count to 2 and you clip, and it's pretty mechanical. Here, this is a young vine, but what you're trying to do is create a three-dimensional object, a sculpture. It's really kind of more of a sculpture. I mean, the reality is I have absolutely no clue what the grapes are going to taste like. Some of them are going to be red, some of them are going to be white, probably even some of them are going to be pink, and some of them are going to be astringent and tannic, and others are going to be elegant and refined, and some are going to be floral, and some are going to be less floral. And luckily, or not so luckily, I've got about 4 or 5 or 6 years to try to figure out how to make sense of all of this. But right now, I'm just kind of stirring the pot, and we'll see what happens. But I think there's an opportunity to have something very complex arise from this kind of slightly random, almost John Cage-ish experiment. Because it is an experiment. No one's done anything quite like this before, to my knowledge.
Once you have the perfect grape auto-tuned to be deemed a Grand Cru at this particular site, you will probably have gone through an assortment of different grape variations and varieties that would be more conducive to being a Grand Cru designatable grape for other areas too. Do you have any ambitions to, perhaps when you find this grape, plant it elsewhere?
I don't think I'm going to live long enough to do that. But you know, honestly, Thomas, I'm not sure it will be the grape, or that there will be the grape, or that I will have the wit to discover the grape. I think it will be the grapes. I think, you know, certainly in the varietal auto-tuning, most likely my bet is the most interesting wine I can make will be a blend of some composition, some percentage of 4 or 5 of the kookiest components of the varietal auto-tuning experiment. So, because remember, if we start with crossing serene with itself, the offspring is not serene. Some of them are going to be serene-ish, and we probably want to pick something that's close to, if you will, the platonic serene, something that resembles what we think of as serene. But the other interesting thing is look at all those strange variants. Look at the ones that are different color, maybe smell a little bit differently or a lot differently, the ones that are hyper peppery, the ones that are hyper tannic, the ones that have kind of extreme qualities. Look at the extremes as well as sort of the harmonic paradigm as well. And then fashion a blend of these in some proportion of one and the other.
When you start actually vinifying and bottling wine down the line, will you also call the business or your producer name Popelouchum, or is that just a name for it? Okay.
No, it's going to be Popelouchum.
And what exactly does that mean?
Popelouchum is a Mutsun Indian word for this general area around San Juan Bautista, and it's a way of the Mutsun distinguish themselves linguistically from other sub-tribes But in the Mutsun dialect, the word Popelouchum also means paradise.
Ah.
So it can mean the village or paradise, both of which apply.
Aptly named, very fitting. How long did it take you to find this specific plot of land?
I looked, after I sold Big House a number of years ago, I went on a lot of realtor dates. Looked far and well. I wouldn't say far, but I looked wide. I looked throughout Central California, and probably looked for about 3 or 4 years until I found this place.
Tell me about this grape, Serene. I don't think a lot of the viewership has ever heard of this grape. What attracts you to it?
Serene is the most sublime expression of Syrah. So Serene is just a clone or biotype of Syrah. It's an antique clone of Syrah, and it's originally grown in Côte Rôtie. And they believe that there may be analogous clones grown elsewhere in the Rhone and Hermitage, where they think that the same grape is called Petite Syrah, not to be confused with Petite Syrah.
Ah, okay.
So it's a smaller cluster, and it tends to produce more flavorful, peppery Syrah than normal Syrah, if you will. Oh my gosh, these guys have gone to town. So these are Serene seedlings, or Serene crossed with Serene seedlings. They've got green shoots on them.
You're potentially dropping a lot of fruit right there, though. Am I right?
No, you're actually not right. And it's not obvious why you're not right, but this is an immature vine that's not going to have any fruit. The vine isn't tall enough to produce. When it reaches a certain height, it sends a hormonal signal to start producing fruit. So this is not big enough. It's still a kid. It's still not even a teenager yet. It's still pre-adolescent.
Wow.
You know, grown-up vines have stakes or some other way of supporting the vines. These, we actually use string. Because there's spaced so close to one another, we use just string to tie them up and train the vine up on string.
Is it unconventional to have them so close to each other?
You can't do this commercially. This is just a nursery. This is really just to see what they can do, and then after we figure out the interesting ones, we're going to take the cuttings and propagate them and grow them elsewhere.
Understood. Would you elaborate a little bit on the belief of terroir, that which surrounds a vineyard site, imparts a certain flavor characteristic of the lay of the land that surrounds it?
This is how I think about it. Maybe it's a little bit tedious argument, but I think of wines as representing a kind of continuum. And one end is what I would call wines of effort, what the French would say vin d'effort, and the other would be wines of place, or vin de terroir. And they resemble one another superficially, but they're different from one another. So on one end, you've got a winemaker who has a strong input and strong fingerprint, strong thumbprint, if you will, on the style of the wine. So they control as many of the variables as possible, and they're, if you will, imposing their stylistic vision on the wine. So these are wines that are, you can call them stylized, or they're highly controlled, and they whether you use the term manipulated or stylistic, they've got a strong winemaker's strong influence. Now, a wine of place or a vin de terroir, the winemaker still works equally hard, but he or she is working in service of something outside of himself or herself, beyond himself. They're working to express somehow capture the qualities that inhere in the site itself, the uniqueness. And every winemaker has a different interpretation of this. The terroir remains the same, but winemakers might interpret it differently. So there are things that you can do that will accentuate, if you will, the characteristics of place, and things that you don't do that will deform the characteristics of place. So for example, harvesting your grapes at an overripe state will deform the articulate qualities of place. Over oaking your wine will deform the quiet voice of terroir. Adding mega purple or other additives, adding tartaric acid, basically the more makeup that you apply, the less of the original beauty and the original visage is evident. You know, so it's tough because everybody wants to, or not everybody, but many people want to express a sense of place, but it's not always obvious what that is. Certain soil types are more expressive than others, more characteristic. So volcanic soils, for example, have a very strong signature. Granitic soils do, limestone soils do, schistous soils do, porphyric soils, and others are more quiet and more subdued and less expressive, if you will. It's like people. Some people are more outgoing, more voluble, and some people are more introverted and less, and just quieter. So we got a little Pinot here this year. Damn, it may be good.
What do you think is the harbinger of perceived good Pinot? What's your barometer? What makes you think this could be any good, just by looking at it?
Frankly, probably just some basic arithmetic. You know, these vines are going to have very little fruit on them. It turns out that the most salient ratio for predictor of wine quality has to do with the ratio of the amount of fruit versus the volume or mass of roots in a vine. So vines that are spaced close together have, relatively speaking, lots of roots compared to the amount of fruit that they have. So that creates a concentration effect. And as long as we keep the ripening even and keep the yield down to a really dull roar, you can't help but turn out really nice fruit. And damn, that really nice fruit has this way of turning into really good wine if you don't screw it up.
I believe it.
So that's my job, is just not screw it up.
Huh.
My colleague JR pruned this block himself, and he persuaded me to go to adopt cane pruning rather than spur pruning, than cordon. I wanted to take the easy route with cordon, but he's a strong believer in cane. He persuaded me. We'll see how it goes, but I think I'm ready to be persuaded.
Wow. Well, at least I always like the aspect of at least having a scapegoat. Should it not turn out perfectly, then it's his fault.
Entirely his fault.
Mm-hmm.
Entirely.
And if it's good, then it's you.
Yeah, of course. Goes without saying.
Of course. How old are these Pinot vines?
Well, you know, I'll tell you something goofy. These are actually the oldest block. We planted this first. These are actually now 8 years old, and we should have a wonderful track record, except for the first year we planted this, you know, trying to knock the weeds down was very challenging, so I had this brilliant idea of bringing in straw mulch, and I thought, well, this is so clever. I'll mulch the heck out of the vineyard, we'll suppress the weeds, great. We'll add organic matter, great. We'll retain moisture, great. All good things will come of this, except what I didn't realize, that I was creating the perfect habitat for the most humongous tree rats that have ever existed. And they totally colonized this place. They made it their home. They created rat schools, rat cafeterias, rat auditoria, rat condominia, rat hospitals, rat everything. Just overran it, killed half the vines. We had to replant the whole darn vineyard after the rats.
That's so sad.
And get rid of all the wonderful mulch.
Did a ratty job of it.
We did. Oh my God, we were.
How sad. It seems that your biggest adversary in this game is your biggest friend and foe at the same time are the forces of nature.
Well, mostly the rodentine component being the main villain. I mean, I don't have so much problems with the other critters, but just the rodents.
Wow.
Of one sort or another are always the problem.
So, Randall, is it safe to assume that should this be a wild success and is the Pinot of your dreams finally, after a lifetime's worth of work, that you'd be shooting yourself in the foot with all of the other, lifetime's worth of work that you've done with other grape varieties?
Yeah, this would create some problems with the narrative. The narrative would be all screwed up.
You'd have to refocus your efforts?
Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, I'd probably just be in denial. I'll just pretend that it's no good.
What a quandary.
I know.